She walked door to door selling wool blankets. The wealthy rancher bought everyone. The blankets were stacked on the seat beside her, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a piece of baling string somebody had used before her, and knotted twice. I saw the wagon from the kitchen window. November, so the light was already going sideways by 3 in the afternoon, and the cold that comes down off the caprock had been sitting on the yard since morning. I wasn't expecting anyone. Hadn't been expecting anyone for a good while. I watched her climb down from that wagon. She didn't look at the house first. She looked at the ground, testing it, the way a person does when they've been on the road long enough that they stop trusting ground that looks flat. She had on a coat that was good once and boots that were still good, and she carried one blanket under her arm like it was something she was delivering on a deadline. I didn't go to the door right away. I'm not proud of that. I stood at the window with a coffee cup I'd forgotten was empty, and I watched her cross my yard. She had a way of walking, not fast, not slow, deliberate, like she'd worked out the exact pace that spent the least and covered the most, and she wasn't going to change it for terrain or weather or anything else. She knocked clean 3 times, not tentative. I went to the door. "My name is Earl Denton. I've been Earl Denton of the Crossbar Ranch for going on 31 years, and in that time I have employed, fed, paid, or lent money to somewhere near 400 men, and I have bought cattle from every direction there is to buy cattle from, and I have sat across a table from lawyers, surveyors, county commissioners, rival ranchers, one state senator I trusted and one I didn't, and a banker out of Amarillo who tried to shortchange me on a note and found out that was a mistake. I'm telling you all of this so you understand that I was not a man who was easily surprised by what was on the other side of a door." She was maybe 35, dark hair going to gray at one temple, just the one which I noticed, which was a strange thing to notice. Eyes that were light-colored but not soft. There are women who look like they have been knocked sideways by their circumstances, and women who look like they are currently deciding what to do about them. She was the second kind. She said, "Mr. Denton, I'm Nora Calloway. I've got wool blankets, good ones, $2 apiece. I'd be grateful for a few minutes. Not I wonder if you might be interested. Not I'm sorry to bother you. Just the offer straight." I said, "Come in out of the cold." She said, "I'll stay here if it's all the same. Easier to show you." So I put on my coat and came out. She had 7 blankets in the wagon. She unfolded one and held it up without fanfare. It was a good blanket, heavy, tight weave, the kind of gray-brown that comes from wool that hasn't been messed with, not dyed, just cleaned and spun and woven. You could see it in the weight of the thing. Real work. I said, "You make these?" She said, "My sheep, my shearing, my loom." A pause. "My children card the wool." She didn't say that last part to make me feel something. She said it the way you say something that's just a fact. I bought all 7. She didn't look surprised exactly, but something in her face shifted, just for a second, and she reset it so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. She counted the money I gave her, $14, and folded it and put it inside her coat, and she said, "I'll be back in 2 weeks with more if you want them." I said I wanted them. I watched her drive off the property, and I stood in the yard with 7 wool blankets and the cold coming down, and I thought, somebody is trying to take that woman's land. I don't know how I knew that. I just did. A woman that capable and that contained, selling blankets in November, does not do it because she wants to. She does it because something has gone wrong and she is working the problem. I went back inside, and I did not think about it any further because it was none of my business. 2 weeks later she came back, 10 blankets this time. I bought all 10. She had a boy with her, maybe 12, sitting up on the seat with his hat pulled down. He looked at the ranch the way boys do when they're trying to look like they're not looking, the barns, the corral, the remuda out in the near pasture. I pretended not to notice. I said, "Your boy." She said, "Thomas. He helps me with the heavy ones." Thomas nodded at me from the wagon seat, with the gravity of someone who had taken on a man's proportion of seriousness before he was ready for it. I asked Nora if they'd eaten. She said they were fine. I said my cook had made more stew than we'd use, and it would go to the dogs otherwise. That was a lie. Hector made exactly the amount of stew that got eaten always, because I paid him enough to think about what he was doing. But she nodded after a moment, and Thomas was down off that wagon before she finished nodding. They ate in the kitchen. I sat at the other end of the table with the account books I'd been meaning to look at, and I did not intrude, which I thought was the right thing. Thomas ate 2 bowls and tried not to look like he was considering a third. Nora ate 1 bowl completely and kept her back straight the whole time. When they were done, she thanked Hector, not me. I noted that. At the door I said, "Same arrangement, 2 weeks." She looked at me for a moment, really looked, the way she'd looked at the ground climbing down from the wagon that first day, like she was assessing something. She said, "You don't need 30 blankets, Mr. Denton." I said, "My bunkhouse gets cold." She said, "I'll be back in 2 weeks." I asked around after that. Not in a way that would get back to her, I was careful about that. I asked Roy Fitch at the feed store because Roy knew everything and was mostly discreet if you caught him before noon. Roy told me. Nora Calloway, widowed 2 years, husband died of a fever, left her with 360 acres, 2 kids, a small flock, and a note on the land held by a man named Gibbons. Clement Gibbons. I knew who that was. Everyone in the county knew who that was. He was not a man who lent money out of generosity. He was a man who lent money to acquire land in installments, because a foreclosure was tidier than a purchase if you had the patience for it. I went home and I sat on my porch and I looked out at the crossbar and I thought about how I had built this, starting with 2 horses, a bedroll, and a summer of wages from a cattle drive when I was 22 years old, 31 years of it, every fence post, every water tank, every barn. I thought about what it would have felt like if someone had been engineering my failure at the back of it. Then I stopped thinking about it, because I already knew what I was going to do. Gibbons had an office above the hardware store in Ray's. I went on a Wednesday because I'd heard he was in town Wednesdays. I want to be precise about this. I did not go there to rescue Nora Calloway. She hadn't asked me to. She didn't know I was going. If I had tried to tell her beforehand, she would have told me politely that it was her problem and her business, and she would have been right. I went because Clement Gibbons was a man who used the law to do things the law was not made for, and I was in a position to make that more difficult for him, and I found I wanted to. That's the truth of it. A man who can act and doesn't, when he sees something clearly wrong being done to someone who can't stop it alone, that's a particular kind of hollowness I've never been able to live with. Gibbons was a small man with a small man's habit of sitting behind large things, big desk, big chair. Portrait of himself on the wall, which told you most of what you needed to know. I sat down without being invited to. I said, "You've got a note on the Calloway place out on the Tascosa Road." He said, "That's not your concern, Mr. Denton." I said, "I'm going to buy it from you." He said the note wasn't for sale. I said, "Everything is for sale to the right number. Give me yours." He gave me a number that was half again what the note was worth, which told me he hadn't planned on selling, but he wasn't going to turn down a profit if I was fool enough to pay it. I paid it. I rode home with a piece of paper in my coat that said I now held Nora Calloway's debt, and I had no idea what I was going to do about that because I had not thought past buying it. She came back in 2 weeks, 12 blankets, Thomas and a girl this time, younger, maybe 9, with her mother's eyes and less patience about hiding her curiosity. She looked at everything directly, the barns, the horses, the hands in the corral, with a frank appetite for detail that I found I liked. Her name was June. Nora introduced her the same way she'd introduced Thomas, matter of fact, no apology for having brought her, no performance of motherliness. Just, "This is June. She's good with figures. I said, is she? June said, what's your remote account? I said, 63 horses. She said, how many working? I said, 41. She considered that. She said, that's a good ratio. Nora pressed her lips together in a way that was almost a smile. I bought the 12 blankets. Then I asked Nora if she'd come inside for a minute, that I had something to show her. I asked Hector to take Thomas and June out to see the horses, which Hector did with the good grace of a man who had been working for me long enough to understand when not to ask questions. At the kitchen table, I put the note in front of her. She looked at it for a long time without touching it, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Then she said, where did you get this? I told her. She said, what do you want for it? I said, same arrangement, 2 weeks. She looked up then. I said, I'll take the blankets against it, at fair value. It'll take a while, but it'll get done. Her face was still and careful. She said, that's not why you bought it. I said, no. She said, Gibbons would have taken the land in the spring. I said, yes. She said, you bought it to stop him. I said, I bought it because I could, and he was wrong to be doing it. What you do with it now is your business. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the note on the table. Then she said, I'll keep bringing blankets. I said, I'll keep buying them. She picked up the note and folded it and put it inside her coat, same place she'd put the $14 that first November afternoon, and she said, thank you, Earl. First time she'd used my name. It went like that for 6 months. Every 2 weeks she came, sometimes with Thomas, sometimes with June, sometimes with both. I started timing certain things on those days. I made sure Hector cooked extra, made sure there was something the kids could do. Thomas developed an attachment to a particular bay gelding named Copper who would not tolerate most people, and was apparently willing to tolerate Thomas, which my foreman Adkins found baffling. June discovered the ranch's tally books and appointed herself an unpaid auditor, which I permitted because she caught a billing error in March that saved me $11. Nora and I talked, not often and not long, but honestly. She told me about the sheep, about the loom, about the work of it. I told her about the ranch, about decisions I was trying to work out. She listened like she was actually listening, not waiting for her turn, actually listening. And she asked questions that were good questions, the kind that made you rethink what you'd said. I found I was thinking more clearly on the days she came. I did not examine that very carefully. A man my age learns not to pick at things that are working. In May, 2 men came to her place. She told me about it the following Wednesday, not the next scheduled Wednesday, but a Wednesday she drove out specifically to tell me. I was in the near pasture when she came, and she waited by the fence. She had the look again, the deciding look. The men were Gibbons's men. They told her the note had been sold, but that their employer had other means of pursuing his interests in the property, and they suggested she might want to consider selling before things got complicated. I stood at the fence and I listened. She said, I told them they were trespassing and to get off my land. I said, did they go? She said, they went, but they'll come back. She was right. They would come back. Gibbons was a patient and spiteful man, and he didn't like losing, and he'd spent enough money on that note that he'd want to make something from the situation. I said, I'll ride out with you. She said, I'm not asking you to do that. I said, I know you're not. She looked at me with those light-colored eyes and she said, if you come out there, people will talk. I said, let them. She was quiet then. Why? There was a real question in it, not a challenge, not a performance. She wanted to know why I kept doing this. What was in it for a man like me, the crossbar and everything on it, nobody to answer to, nothing left to prove. I thought about how to answer it honestly, and I said, Because I have spent a long time being useful to people who didn't give a damn about me, and not particularly useful to people who did. I'm trying to correct that. She looked at me for a long time. She said, I give a damn about you, Earl. Flat. Plain, not performed. I didn't say anything. I looked at the pasture and the horses and the sky going orange over the caprock, and I felt something in my chest settle, some weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had a shape. I rode out there the next day, and the day after. The men came back on the third day, 2 of them, same 2, with the loose posture of men who'd been told the situation was soft. Adkins was with me, and Pete Ray's, my oldest hand, who was 60 and looked like something left out in the weather, but was not a man you wanted to be standing across from. The 2 men looked at the 3 of us and recalculated. I said, this is Nora Calloway's land. She's got clear title. You're trespassing. The older of the 2 said, Mr. Gibbons has an interest in. I said, Mr. Gibbons's interest ended when he sold the note. I know the county recorder. I know the sheriff. I know the state land office. And every man in this county knows the crossbar. You go back and tell Clement Gibbons that. They went. I don't know if it was the names or the reputation, or just the arithmetic of 3 men who looked like they meant it. It doesn't matter. They went and they didn't come back, and 3 weeks later I heard Gibbons had shifted his attention to a property up near Vega, which was someone else's problem to sort out. The blankets were paid off in September. She came out to tell me. She didn't have blankets with her, just herself, which was unusual enough that I noticed it immediately. She had on a different coat, a good one, brown wool, and her hair was down a little differently. I registered all of this and said nothing about any of it. She sat at the kitchen table and she put an envelope on it and she said, That's the last of it. I had a good summer. Sold wool to 3 different buyers. I said, good. She said, I don't owe you anything now. I said, you never owed me anything. She said, that's not how money works, Earl. I said, it's how this worked. She looked at me. She did that thing where she was assessing, weighing something, the way she'd looked at the ground and the note and the men in the pasture. Measuring the load before she committed to carrying it. She said, I'd like to keep coming out here. I said, then come. She said, not for the blankets. I said, I know. She put her hand on the table, palm down, near mine but not touching, an inch of table between us, and she looked at me with something in her face I hadn't seen on anyone's face in a very long time. Not pity, not gratitude, just, you, this man, I see him and I'm choosing him. I turned my hand over and she put hers in it. We stayed like that for a while. Hector was out of the kitchen. The afternoon light came through the window at a long angle and hit the table, and outside you could hear the horses and the very distant sound of Thomas talking to Copper in the corral. And June was somewhere recalculating something with absolute authority. And it was quiet in the way that things are quiet when they've found where they're supposed to be. That was 4 years ago. She moved the sheep over to the east pasture, bet her grass. The Calloway place is still hers, still in her name, always will be. Thomas is 16 now and working the ranch with real ability. June is 13 and has reorganized my accounting system twice, and I let her because she's right about it. The loom is still running. Nora still weaves, not to sell door to door, just because she likes the doing of it. There's a blanket on the bed that she made last winter, the same gray-brown of that first one I bought in November, and it is heavier than it looks. I'm 64 years old and I have built something worth looking at, and I have a woman beside me who sees it for what it is, and who chose it knowing every part of it. Not the money, the man. There's a particular kind of thing that happens when a good woman chooses you, not because she needs to, not because she has no other option, but because she looked at everything you are and decided that's what she wants. You can work your whole life and not feel it. Some men never do. I got there the long way. But I got there,